in my last lecture, I presented this plan, which I'm particularly proud of, because I don't think anyone had drawn it before. And what this plan shows, just to remind you, is the base material upon which the West End was founded. And this is the Manor of Westminster that was purchased by Henry VIII and then subsequently developed by the Stuarts. So all of this land here, from the Westbourne River right over actually to Drury Lane, which isn't on this map here, and up here to Oxford Street, formed the land purchased by Henry VIII and then subsequently developed by monarchs after that. And I did mention, I think, in my last lecture that this huge amount of land purchased by Henry VIII included Covent Garden. But I didn't pursue the idea, knowing that I was going to talk about it this evening. So that is exactly what I'm going to do tonight. I'm going to talk about the part of the West End that lies between St Martin's Lane and Drury Lane on the east. And I'm going to focus in particular on the Theatre Royal in Drury Lane. But first I just need to recap a little bit. Like the story I told you last time, what I'm going to talk about this evening really starts with Henry VIII. And he, as I've already said, purchased everything that you see on this map. And the furthest eastern boundary of the Tudor royal lands were, in fact, Drury Lane, an ancient, in fact, a Saxon road named after a barrister who built his house there in the latter part of Henry VII's reign. And the land that we now know as Covent Garden was originally orchards and pasture and a little bit of woodland, which belonged to Westminster Abbey and was bought from Westminster Abbey with all the rest of the Westminster lands by Henry VIII. But unlike the land that you see on this map, particularly the area that is now St James's, Henry VIII didn't particularly need Covent Garden. And he and his son Edward VI granted out 40 acres of Covent Garden to the Earl of Bedford in two grants, one in 1541 and the second in 1552. And so in this way, the Bedford family came to own the 40 acres at the heart of what Covent Garden is today. And you might be able to see the dotted line here that defines the land they bought. Here's St Martin's Lane, here's Long Acre, and here's Drury Lane, and this is the 40 acres here purchased, granted to the Bedford family by the Tudors. Their own house, Bedford House, as I shall go on to show you, was built in the southern portion here, just north of the Strand. As I explained in my last lecture, monarchs from Queen Elizabeth onwards attempted to control the growth of London, and in particular, they passed a series of proclamations banning the building of new houses in Westminster. As far as we know, the Earl of Bedford didn't contravene any of these regulations himself, but in 1612, we know that he encompassed the land you see on this map here with a substantial brick wall and divided it into two more or less equal parts. Remarkably, we have this plan drawn in 1612, which shows the wall that is built around the Bedford lands. Here's Drury Lane. Here is Long Acre, says it up here. Here's St Martin's Lane. Down here is the Strand. And you can see there are two chunks of land here. There's the bit in the middle, which says Covent Garden pasture. This is the land that the Earl of Bedford kept for himself. And then there's this peripheral land here that is leased out to a number of individual leaseholders, supposedly for them to farm. But in reality, as I will go on to explain, they started building houses on it. What this map shows us is that whilst the Earl himself kept the Covent Garden pasture clear, his tenants erected a whole lot of illegal dwellings all the way around it. Now, we actually know roughly how many houses were built illegally on this strip of land around the edge, because in 1634, the Earl was taken to court for illegally building these houses, or allowing these houses to be built. And a surviving survey, which I think almost certainly is connected with this court case, show that 504 houses had been built on the periphery of the Covent Garden pasture by that date. Now, as I explained last time, James I and Charles I were not implacably opposed to new building in Westminster, but it had to be done on their terms and to their specification, as the example of Charles I and St James's Square shows quite happily. And under James I and Charles I, several aristocrats got permission to build mansions on royal freehold land. And in 1628, Charles I's attention turned to these Bedford Lands as a possible site for some prestigious housing development. In fact, the idea of developing Covent Garden probably came from the pressing need of St Martin's Parish to build a chapel of ease to accommodate the rapidly growing population who couldn't fit into St Martin in the Fields. And in fact, we have a letter from Archbishop Laud, the Archbishop of Canterbury, asking the 4th Earl of Bedford whether, in fact, a chapel of ease could be built on this pasture land you see in the middle of this map to relieve the pressure on St Martin in the Fields. Now, the Earl of Bedford was a shrewd businessman, and he saw the opportunity that the construction of a new church would give him to develop his pasture land for housing if he could get a royal licence to do so. But before the poor man knew it, Inigo Jones, accompanied by the king himself, turned up in the middle of his pasture and got out plans that they'd already prepared, not only for the construction of a church, but for the development of a brand new high-class housing estate. Now, again, remarkably, we have two of these plans, these sketches, in the hand of Inigo Jones. Now, I don't know whether this is the actual piece of paper that they were holding in the field, but it must have been something very like it, because what it shows is the block, which we know now, on which St Paul's Church, Covent Garden, was eventually built. Here is the piazza, where the Covent Garden market is, and you can see here the roads going into it. There's another plan, very similar, but helpfully this one shows to the south here the area that was occupied by Bedford House itself. And so there was a very close relationship between the Earl's house and the development of the piazza. And here, of course, is the church and the churchyard around it. So these sketches show an entirely different sort of development to any development that had hitherto been seen in London. If you look at the way that this is constructed, what you can see is a closed environment. There are no real through roads here. You can't do a quick cut through Covent Garden. This is deliberately constructed to be approached circuitously, to avoid undesirable through traffic, and to keep the area socially exclusive. Now, we know that this was not what the 4th Earl of Bedford had in mind. He wanted to have something much simpler and something much cheaper. In fact, later in another legal case that resulted in this, he claimed that the royal intervention had put at least £6,000 on the cost of his development. But, nevertheless, the Earl got a licence from the king to build his new scheme and went ahead under the beady eye of Inigo Jones, Charles I, and the Privy Council itself. And so this, ladies and gentlemen, is how we got Covent Garden, the Covent Garden that we know so well from paintings, drawings, and prints. And this is this astonishing aerial view of London. I've shown it many times in lots of different contexts in this lecture hall. But tonight it shows brilliantly the piazza, as it was called, with the houses designed by Inigo Jones and designed very specifically to attract a better class of residents. You see the church here, and to the south, the gardens of Bedford House and Bedford House itself. And this is something it's hard to grasp today because, of course, this is where the covered market is. This is all built over now. Whilst you think of this development here as being designed for the aristocrats who would want to have townhouses here, of course, it actually also provided a fantastic view for the Earl of Bedford himself. So these new houses, which you see on this print also here, very quickly became extremely fashionable and attracted many prominent courtiers. And I think, interestingly, it also attracted a small colony of leading painters, including Daniel Mittens and Paul van Sommer, which is an interesting side point to make. Well, let's move onwards through the Civil War and through the Commonwealth to the Restoration. Because after 1660, the area again began to become a focus for royal attention. But this time, royal attention of a fundamentally different sort. Throughout the Middle Ages, plays, or what we might call theatre, had been tremendously popular with all sectors of society. Like so many aspects of medieval life, theatre was itinerant. Groups of players moved from place to place, performing in market squares and inn yards, or the houses or castles of the rich patrons. But in the Elizabethan period, things began to change. London had grown into a vast and rich city with a population hungry for entertainment and hedonism. The staging of plays in the yards of inns had become an almost permanent feature of everyday life. And as they did, the managers of theatre companies realised that they could significantly increase their profits if they cut out the innkeepers and built their own venues. And so in the late 1570s and 1580s came the first purpose-built theatres in England. They were circular or octagonal arenas without roofs, with tiered seating on 4 or 5 levels. And this is Holler's view of about 1644, showing the Globe and the Hope. Actually, the labels are the wrong way around, but you can see very prominently the two theatres in Southwark on the south bank. We, of course, today are all very familiar with this because we have got the reconstructed Globe, but we also know that the Globe is very accurately rebuilt, and this drawing by Johann Witz of the Swan Theatre, done in 1596, is a piece of contemporary evidence showing these raised stages which projected out into the audience. The audience could stand on 3 sides of the stage, either standing round the edge there or up in the galleries. The actors made their entrance from one of 2 doors at the back of the stage, and there was very little opportunity for the use of scenes or sets. And of course, all the performances had to be carried out in broad daylight in the early afternoon. In the early 17th century, under the patronage of James I and his courtiers, many of these theatrical companies would also run a winter season, acting in great halls or even in royal palaces. And it's possible to visualise this if we make a quick stroll down the road from here and go to Middle Temple Hall. Just off the Strand, we see the very room in which wintertime performances were acted. And so it was in theatres like this, either in the winter or in the summer, that Shakespeare, Marlowe and Ben Jonson worked. Their audiences comprised most elements of the society: apprentices, shopkeepers, craftsmen, lawyers, merchants, civil servants, even the nobility. And the cost of admission was very affordable, a penny to go in the pit. This is about a fifth of a labourer's daily wage, whilst a stool on the stage was sixpence and a box or private room was a shilling. Now, the great popularity of the theatre under Elizabeth and James established 7 playhouses in London, and they became increasingly undermined by the religious and moral sensibilities of middle-class lawyers, merchants, academics, and churchmen. They began to associate the stage with sin, social unrest, and moral laxness. And they, of course, were right. The theatres were located near brothels, and prostitutes cruised the audiences for clients. Young men went to plays to be seen and to rub shoulders and perhaps some of their more intimate parts with girls. Drinking, rowdiness, and the occasional brawl were all part of a good evening out at the theatre. William Prynne, writing in the mid-1630s, thought, and I quote, "Popular stage plays were the very pomp of the devil, sinful, heathenish, lewd, ungodly spectacles, and most pernicious corruption, condemned in all ages as intolerable mischiefs to churches, to the manners, minds, and souls of men." He wasn't mincing any words there. And these attitudes towards the stage actually became official policy as Parliament set itself up as an alternative to Charles I's monarchy. In 1642, Parliament banned theatre supposedly until the Troubles were over, and the Globe was destroyed in 1644, the Fortune, the Phoenix and Salisbury Court theatres in 1649, and the Blackfriars Theatre in 1655. So when, in May 1660, Charles II returned in triumph from exile to re-establish the monarchy on the crumbled ruins of Oliver Cromwell's austere republic, with him was the future manager of the Theatre Royal, Drury Lane, Thomas Killigrew. Courtier, playwright, womanizer, and wit. And you see him here sporting his royalist credentials with a great pile of books, and I love the dog at his knees, which is actually, you probably can't see it, is wearing a collar with Killigrew written around it. He was born in 1612, and at the age of 21, he entered the court as a page to Charles I. His first and most popular play was a bawdy comedy called The Parson's Wedding. But he also wrote and performed a number of tragedies before the outbreak of the Civil War, and as he did so, he earned himself a reputation as a reckless spendthrift. This engraving, published by Holler, portrays him in despair, with a monkey perched on his shoulder, dressed in a sort of dressing gown, which is decorated with the recognisable portraits of 24 women. This was an illustration to a poem of his called Lechery. So, this very colourful figure during the Civil War fled to the continent, where he won himself a second wife with a dowry of £10,000, and he hovered around the court of the exiled Charles II, entertaining him with wit and humour of an exceedingly doubtful taste. And it was presumably during this period that he secured a promise to be granted a licence to run a theatre if Charles was to ever reclaim his throne. Well, on the 25th of May, 1660, the Royal Charles sailed into Dover to be greeted by the great Cromwellian General Monk and a crowd of joyous subjects. Killigrew had been entertaining the king on deck, and Pepys records his jokes. But either 300 years or something in the telling makes it almost impossible to find them remotely funny today. Read them for yourself. I'm not even going to read them out. But thanks to the increasingly regal Oliver Cromwell allowing the performance of a limited number of plays from the 1650s, London in 1660 had at least 3 playhouses. At Drury Lane, there was the Cockpit, with a troupe of actors under the management of John Rhodes, a former bookseller. In Clerkenwell was the Red Bull, an inn, and William Beeston and his troupe were installed at the Salisbury Court Playhouse. But within 2 months of the Restoration, Charles II overrode the businesses of these 3 managers. A royal warrant gave the sole right to stage theatrical productions to just 2 men, William Davenant and Thomas Killigrew. Killigrew had received his reward for entertaining King Charles with 6 years of bawdy jokes. William Davenant, who had been granted a patent for a theatre back in 1639, had journeyed to France to petition the future king while he was still in exile. To ensure their monopoly was watertight, the warrant also ordered that all other theatres would be, and this is the word the warrant uses, absolutely suppressed. Davenant and Killigrew were to have extra privileges too. They were allowed to censor their own plays, employ women as actors. This is absolutely radical, the very, very first time it happened. And by 1663, these licenses that they had been given were made hereditary. So, why did Charles give only 2 licenses for theatres in Restoration London? A king so fond of entertainment might have been expected to issue many more. Well, of course, the answer is that the theatre was still capable of being politically extremely subversive. In Restoration London, violence, civil disorder, religious dissent bubbled vigorously beneath the surface. Neither Charles, his courtiers, or business interests wanted this substrata of disorder stirred up more than was necessary. The king, quite simply, wanted to make sure that he could control political and religious satire in London and prevent it from getting out of control. Killigrew was given a licence to form a company of actors by the king called the King's Men, and remarkably, the present Theatre Royal Drury Lane still operates under that very same licence. The King's brother and successor, James Duke of York, gave Davenant a company to be known as the Duke's Men, and they eventually, in the later 18th century, established themselves where the Royal Opera House is now, and Covent Garden Opera House still uses that same patent granted by the Duke of York. As their status became a legal reality, Davenant and Killigrew must have rubbed their hands with glee. 7 theatres were built in London between 1576 and 1605. London at the time had 200,000 inhabitants, whilst in 1660 there were 300,000 inhabitants, and in Greater London perhaps as many as 500,000. And only 2 theatres now could carve up this massive London audience between them. Although, over the years, various other theatres did spring up, their monopoly lasted, at least in law, until 1843. Now, both Killigrew and Davenant soon opted to convert tennis courts into theatres. This is the plan you've seen, the drawing you've seen before. This was probably in response to the fashion for using indoor tennis courts for theatrical performances in France. But by November 1660, Killigrew had already moved a troupe of actors into Gibbons's tennis court in the now lost Vere Street, that is A. So that's where Kingsway is. The whole site of it's been, Kingsway ploughs through that area where A is, but that's where the first Killigrew theatre was. It wasn't very satisfactory. The stage had no accommodation for scenery, and the auditorium only sat 400 people. And so he began to make plans to build a new theatre in Drury Lane. Now, we don't know how much thought he gave to the location of this new theatre. There had been a theatre there, sited in the old cockpit at the Restoration, and so I suppose there was a precedent. But it must have been, I think, the case that Killigrew wanted to build his theatre near the houses of potential wealthy patrons. In fact, before the Civil War, Killigrew himself had lived in the piazza at Covent Garden. On the other hand, at least some of the first Restoration residents of Covent Garden must have been drawn there by the theatre itself. Indeed, like a character in Thomas Nabbs's play, which was actually called Covent Garden. In this play, a character announces, and I quote, "We shall then be near the cockpit in Drury Lane and see a play now and then." But in reality, more than improving the social mix of the piazza, the Theatre Royal probably stimulated tavern life in the area and led to a very large number of local coffee houses. So just to be clear, C is where the Theatre Royal eventually ended up. There was another theatre in Lincoln's Inn, in B there, but essentially Killigrew's lot moved from Vere Street in A to C in just off Drury Lane. So the principal effect of this was the stimulation of taverns and coffee houses, and one of the first of these was opened at the northeast corner of Bow Street and Russell Street in the same year as the opening of the Theatre Royal. Will's Coffeehouse was founded a few years later, nearly opposite in Bow Street. And these coffee houses, founded as a direct result of the theatre being there, played an extremely important part in the political and cultural life of London. At Will's Coffeehouse, Dryden hung out, and he was spotted there by Pepys in 1664. This was Pepys's first visit to a coffee house, and he records in his diary, "I stopped at the great coffee house there, where I never was before, where Dryden, the poet, I knew at Cambridge, and all the wits of the town, and Harris the player, and Mr. Hook of our college were there." The Bedford Coffee House in the Piazza was frequented by Fielding, Pope, Sheridan, Churchill, Garrick, Foote, Quin, Collins, Horace Walpole, and others. So, in this area where a huge new intellectual, cultural, social, political life was bubbling up, Killigrew succeeded in raising the capital to build his new theatre, the point here, C. You can see it with the arrow pointed there, and you can see it in relation to the piazza. The piece of land he got was not really a very satisfactory one. As you can see, it was landlocked. It was almost completely surrounded on all four sides with other buildings. But his new theatre was completed in May 1663 at the cost of £2,400. Killigrew's new playhouse was fully equipped to deal with scenery and spectacle, but it wasn't very big. The ground plan was probably around the same size as the present stage of the Theatre Royal Drury Lane, so it wasn't very big. It didn't last long. In January 1672, the theatre burnt to the ground, taking with it all its scenery, costumes, and a good number of the surrounding taverns and coffee houses. So Killigrew and his shareholders had to start again, and to finance the new theatre, they further complicated matters by mortgaging the lease of the new site and the royal patent. It's not known exactly how much money they raised, but the cost of the theatre was probably somewhere between £3,500 and £4,500. With the site and the finance, all Killigrew now needed was an architect. Well, we don't know who designed the first theatre, but it may well have been John Webb, who had built theatres at Whitehall Palace before the Civil War and again in 1665. But Webb was dead by 1674, and it seems as if Killigrew turned to Christopher Wren. Now, by this date, Wren was indisputably the most famous, successful and fashionable architect in England. Charles II had chosen him to rebuild Whitehall Palace and had sent him to France to get ideas for the new building. He'd only a few years later been put in charge of the architectural aspects of rebuilding London after the Great Fire. And in 1669, he's made surveyor of the King's works. Wren and Killigrew must have known each other, though I think it's extremely doubtful that they could have ever been friends, given Wren's rather austere and serious-minded character and Killigrew's foppishness. But Killigrew's wife, Charlotte, was the first lady of the Queen's Privy Chamber. So she was a very senior figure in the royal household, and they had a big lodging at Whitehall Palace, and Wren unquestionably would have known them both. We don't know what brief Killigrew gave Wren. We don't know whether even Charles II was involved in the discussion about the design. But whatever happened, we think that Wren was commissioned to build this new theatre. Now, this wasn't, technically speaking, the first theatre Wren had ever built, because, of course, he'd built the Sheldonian Theatre, his very, very first building in Oxford, but it wasn't really a theatre. It was more of a university assembly hall. And whilst things like acoustics and sightline were important, it wasn't the same as building a theatre. And Killigrew must have expected Wren to design him the most modern and fashionable theatre possible. And in doing so, I think both architect and patron looked to France. While Charles II was in exile in Paris, Louis XIV put him up in a building that we know today as the Palais Royal. And it was in this building that France's first modern theatre was built in 1635 for Cardinal Richelieu. Charles and possibly Killigrew also knew this theatre very well. But by 1672, it was extremely old-fashioned. And the theatre that everybody looked to was the one that was built in 1659 in the Tuileries in front of the Louvre. And here you see Mariette's engraving of it, published in his Architecture Française in 1727. This theatre was designed by Italian architects on an Italian model and must have been seen by Sir Christopher Wren when he was in Paris in 1664. Whether he bought engravings of the building when he was there, or whether he sent for them later, or whether he took sketches of it, we don't know. But what we can be fairly certain is that Wren used this great French theatre as his model. And we know this because there survives in the hand of Wren this drawing for Killigrew's new theatre. It's a section which shows this is the Catherine Street end here, the Drury Lane end is that side. Here are the stairs which take you up to the gallery, to the circle. Here are the stalls and the pit. Here's the stage, very, very deep stage here. I'll talk about that in a moment here. Here are the boxes. At the back of the stage above here is the famous green room in which the actors got dressed and in which the audience would crowd into after the performance to talk to the actors and admire them. Even if this drawing shows the theatre as it was finally built, and we can't be totally sure of that because this could be a preliminary drawing, it doesn't really give us much idea of the site, because the site actually was extremely problematic from the start. And this is my reconstruction of the site of the first Theatre Royal Drury Lane, or the second one, the Wren one, which I published a couple of years ago now. And you can see how, like the first theatre, it's completely surrounded by houses. All that shaded area are houses and taverns. And the only way you could get in was through a door on what was then Bridges Street, now Catherine Street, and you went down a long, thin passage to get into the theatre, and a very long, thin passage for the actors to come in and go at the back. So there is an important question here, an important architectural question, which is that given that this theatre is completely surrounded by buildings, how did Christopher Wren get light into the auditorium? And the answer to that question can be found in a map of the West End published in 1681-2, part of a project started by John Ogleby to survey the city and the West End. And this map of the West End had small vignettes of important buildings drawn in perspective. And one of these is the Drury Lane Theatre, there. And if you look at that very closely, you can see that it shows a roof that is very similar to the roof on the Wren drawing, but with the addition of a dome. And that dome, I think, was providing light to the interior of the theatre, and this would make it the first dome to be built in England. Those of you who came to my lecture on the Royal College of Surgeons would have heard me claiming that to be the first dome in England. Well, I was wrong. This is the first dome in England. I doubt if I'm going to find another one earlier. So there is one other chance survival that helps us to bring the interior of Wren's only theatre to life, and that is an engraving here, which was used as a frontispiece to an opera called Ariadne. And this shows the proscenium arch of the theatre with these great Corinthian pilasters, which you just saw a few moments ago in Wren's drawing, and it quite clearly shows the stage and the scenery for the opera that was performed at the Theatre Royal in Drury Lane in 1674. Well, the opening of this theatre on the 26th of March 1674 heralded a new age in London theatre-going. There was a world of difference between covered tennis courts or the theatres of the South Bank, the circular Elizabethan theatres, and Wren's French-inspired, purpose-designed theatre equipped with all the latest technology. The gulf was perhaps even wider for a pre-Restoration audience that would have found it hard to reconcile their experience of theatre-going with this style. This new theatre was smaller, it was indoors, the seats were much more expensive, and as a consequence, it was much more like the wintertime Jacobean performance populated by the better off and the more educated. And so the incredible social mix of the pre-Commonwealth theatre was to be banished from the world of live entertainment until the coming of the modern rock concert. Now, this, of course, was reflected in the social mix of Covent Garden, a mix that now saw very regular visits by the king himself. This is a reconstruction, not one of mine, of the Theatre Royal Drury Lane. And it's not marked, but what it shows is that these boxes here, the stage boxes here, were actually a royal box that was reserved for the king. And if you go to the Theatre Royal today, you'll see there is still a royal box reserved for the monarch, although these days, of course, you can hire it yourself. Charles II was an extremely regular visitor. He was passionate about the theatre, and he was very happy to be seen out in his box, as actually plays were very rarely performed at court. And within a very small number of years, a group of young literati, known as the Wits, had gathered round the king, and his patronage of the Wits and his enjoyment of their company made writing for the theatre highly fashionable amongst the upper echelons of society. And it perhaps drew more playwrights into the history of the theatre than at any other point. These people came from the aristocracy and the gentry. And of course, they were incorporating amusing portrayals of each other in their comedies, lots and lots of in-jokes, which of course makes their work really rather indigestible and, not to say sometimes, incomprehensible today. But the Restoration, as a consequence, saw for the first time the emergence of actors as celebrities. People such as Anne Bracegirdle and Thomas Betterton, who was the most renowned actor of his age. And he was, in fact, buried in Westminster Abbey with his wife, so famous he was. And so going to the theatre was not an unusual evening out for most of the well-heeled audience that attended the Theatre of Drury Lane in Charles II's reign. It was part of the leisure circuit for rich and fashionable society. They went frequently, if not several times a week, several times a month, and they were very happy to see the same play again and again. And this was a big attraction for living in Covent Garden. Like going to church, theatregoers went to be seen and to see. And the design of Wren's theatre, which you see here, facilitated this. Large candle-filled chandeliers ensured that the auditorium was just as bright as the stage. Like going to church, theatregoers unlike going to church, theatregoers were quite rowdy. As in the Jacobean period, their behaviour sometimes just degenerated into sort of drunken brawls. The audience chatted and joked through performances. They heckled actors and their fellows. And it was customary for fashionably dressed young wits to show off with humorous asides or witty interjections as the actors were in mid-stride, often jumping onto the stage themselves. The actors, in their turn, often played along, giving as good as they got. And of course, the person who came to Charles II's notice, because she was brilliant at doing this, was Nell Gwynn, who could reduce the audience to helpless laughter and a fast rejoinder when these people had a go at her. But the Restoration Theatre, you mustn't just simply think of it as a bawdy, licentious and rowdy plaything of the aristocracy. The performances were not just incidental background entertainment, but were judged by the excellence of the players and the quality of the plays. Men such as the diarist John Evelyn, Judge Jeffreys of the Bloody Assizes, the scientist and architect Robert Hooke, and Christopher Wren himself were all regular playgoers. The social division of the house, and I suspect to a degree its behaviour, roughly followed the seat prices. The upper gallery, which you see up there, cost £1 and attracted the most derision from satirists, along with the middle gallery, which cost 18p. The most expensive seats, at 2 shillings and 6p, were in the pit, directly in front of the stage. And obviously also in the boxes. Pepys's outrage at citizens, apprentices and others in the theatre was mainly at their presence in the expensive seats, which annoyed him much more than seeing lowlier colleagues lauding it in better seats than himself. Now, whilst we might be able to imagine a Restoration audience, even if we might not have wanted to be part of one, it is very difficult for us to imagine a Restoration play as it was originally acted. And this is really partly because no theatre survives today in which the Restoration layout of stage, scenery and seats actually survives. At Drury Lane, the main performance took place on a stage which projected some 20 foot beyond the proscenium arch. So there's the proscenium arch, and here is the stage. Here is the proscenium arch, Here is the stage projecting out 20 feet. Today, we would call it a thrust stage, which came out into the audience. But what you can see from Wren's cross-section is that behind the proscenium arch, there was another stage. It was called the scenic stage. And the scenic stage here was the place, as the title suggests, where the scenery was set out. And the full depth of the scenic stage was 45 feet. But it looked even deeper by the use of scenery painted in perspective dwindling to a vanishing point at the back of the back wall. And the scenes were painted on a number of sliding flats, and you can see them here, which slid backwards and forwards. And in this reconstruction, again, you can see the sliding flats, which slid in grooves, worked by strings underneath, which enabled, actually, very rapid changes of scene to take place. Underneath the stage was a complicated system of pulleys and ropes, and the technology, actually, all came from the Navy. It was based on a system of blocks and pulleys as used on sailing ships. And the only drawback was the terrible noise that made these, that happened when they changed the scenes. And so usually they covered this with sound effects. So when the scenes changed, there was a great roll of thunder caused usually by a cannonball being rolled down a big piece of wood, which hid the noise of the changes of scenery. So this visually and technically complex arrangement could instantly reveal spectacular scenes of horrific carnage, victims in the throes of torture, the inside of a prison, tombs, vaults, even heaven and hell. And here you see this scene from Ariadne, again, showing the deep perspective of the scenic stage. So Wren and Killigrew's theatre remained until the 1770s, when the great actor-manager David Garrick commissioned the greatest architect of his day, Robert Adam, to finally give the theatre a street frontage. And it was a magnificent thing. And here you see the basic recladding of the outside of the Theatre Royal, Drury Lane, by Robert Adam, with a rusticated basement and an elegant Ionic columns, supporting a pediment containing the royal arms, which you can see balancing on the top there. No one could be in any doubt that behind this elegant facade lay a place of real quality and style. Inside, Robert Adam dismantled most of Wren's interior fittings, enlarging the size of the auditorium and the stage at the expense of some of the subsidiary offices at the back. And what I think is particularly interesting about this drawing is the ceiling. The ceiling that you see in this engraving, we know is the ceiling that was installed by Robert Adam, because the original coloured watercolours for it still exist in the Soane Museum in Lincoln's Inn Fields. And although you can see a sort of hole in the middle, which is apparently looking up at the sky, this is actually a canvas that goes all the way across. This is a bit of trompe-l'oeil in the middle. And I think that the reason that, that Adam creates this trompe-l'oeil dome in the middle is because he is imitating the dome that Christopher Wren had in that theatre that was taken out by Adam, but people had got very used to at the time. Indeed, by Adam's time, the theatre was lit entirely by candlelight, and there was no natural light in the auditorium at all. By this time, though, a big social change had come over the whole of Covent Garden. The theatre was still very much patronised by royalty and the aristocracy, but it was no longer the place to live. In 1670, the Earl of Bedford was granted rights to hold a market in the piazza. And while the Drury Lane Theatre had contributed to the rather sort of raffish nature of the area in the years after the Restoration, the foundation of the market had a much more profound effect. The market basically spoiled the appearance of the piazza. It filled the streets with noise and traffic, and although for more than 200 years it earned an ever-increasing income for its owners, it eventually became such a heavy political liability that in the early years of the 20th century, the 11th Duke of Bedford decided to sell both it and the whole of the Covent Garden estate. And it was only at that point, amazingly, that the Theatre Royal Drury Lane ceased to be a leasehold site of the Duke of Bedford and became a freehold site, which it, of course, is today. So what had once been the most fashionable quarter of the West End, yielding some of the highest rents and attracting the country's most important theatres, it now became famous as a fruit and vegetable market. But of course, its theatrical connections are continue today, not just by one, but by two great theatres, because in 1731 along came what we now know as the Royal Opera House to join the Theatre Royal Drury Lane. But the Opera House is really a Johnny-come-lately, because the Theatre Royal that stands today has the longest continuous record of performances of any theatre in the world. There are older theatres, but none that still put on 8 shows a week. Thank you very much.